The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 40, The Space Between Us, The Mystery of Connection. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we untangle the subtle patterns, hidden emotions, and unspoken thresholds that shape how we connect. In our last conversation, we explored exits and entrances. Today, we turn toward the thresholds of relationships themselves, the moments of beginning, the decisions to stay, and the courage to leave. Every connection carries these doorways. Sometimes they arrive gently, in the form of a new friendship or an unexpected return. Other times they demand everything, forcing us to decide whether staying is an act of love or an act of fear, whether leaving is abandonment or liberation. This episode is about recognizing those thresholds not as failures or endings, but as transformations. We'll move through personal stories of knowing when to go, psychological and spiritual insights on transitions, and practices for listening to the quiet wisdom that tells us when a chapter is truly over. Because exits and entrances aren't just about others, they are about how we honor ourselves in the movement between holding on and letting go. So let's begin. Conscious connection, every arc has to end somewhere, and yet relationships rarely offer clean endings. They are open, fluid, mysterious, shifting like currents we swim in, but never fully command. This episode doesn't seek to solve the riddle of relationships, but to dwell in their mystery. Because if mirrors show us who we are, bridges carry us closer, and silence marks the unspoken, then perhaps what we've been circling all along is the vast, unseen space between us. This space is not empty. It is charged with meaning, emotion, memory, and possibility. It's where intimacy is born, where boundaries are tested, where presence deepens, and where absence can wound. To close this arc, we'll explore what can't always be explained, the intangible quality of connection itself, themes and attributes, mystery of connection, why relationships feel larger than the sum of their parts, presence versus absence, how we sense others beyond words, relational depth, what happens when encounters move from surface to soul, transcendence, the spiritual, existential, and unexplainable elements of human connection, the unspoken currents. There's something we all recognize but rarely name, those moments when connection feels alive, almost electric. It isn't about agreement or words or even shared history. It's something deeper, like a current running between two shores. Think of the way silence with a stranger on a train can feel more profound than chatter with an old friend, or the way eye contact across a crowded room can say more than paragraphs ever could. What fascinates me is how these moments resist measurement. You can't put them in a graph or reduce them to a list of communication skills. They don't follow the logic of if you do this, then they'll feel that. Instead, they arrive almost like the weather, unpredictable, intangible, and yet undeniable. Sometimes, the space between us feels magnetic, as though we are drawn into a deeper knowing of each other without explanation. Other times, that very same space can feel fractured, like standing on opposite sides of an invisible wall. Both are real, and both remind us that connection is not simply about me or you, but about the delicate, unseen fabric that stretches between us. When we stop filling the space with constant noise, we begin to sense it. We notice the charge in silence, the weight of someone's gaze, the warmth or coldness that lingers in a room. These are the subtle cues of a relationship, the ones we often miss, yet they shape us more profoundly than we realize. Personal reflection. I remember a time when I sat in silence with a friend after a particularly difficult period in my life. No advice was given, no attempts were made to cheer me up. We simply sat, both staring out of the window. And yet I felt more seen in that silence than in any conversation I'd had for weeks. It wasn't what he said, it was his presence, the sense that he was there with me, not trying to change the moment, but willing to sit in it. That silence didn't feel empty, it felt held. But there's another memory, almost opposite in its texture. I once spent months in a group where everyone was talking, laughing, and filling the air with noise, but I felt utterly disconnected. The more words were spoken, the more absent the connection felt. It wasn't that people were cruel or dismissive, it was that no one was truly present. My body felt it before my mind could articulate it. I was surrounded, but I was alone. These two experiences showed me the spectrum of what space between us can mean. In one, silence held me. In the other, noise drowned me, and both taught me that connection isn't measured by the amount of interaction, but by the quality of the space we share. When presence is real, even silence can heal. When presence is absent, even the busiest rooms feel hollow. Psychological and philosophical insight Martin Buber's I Thou philosophy captures this mystery. He argued that true relationships occur when we meet the other not as an object, it, but as a living presence, I thou. In those moments, the relationship itself becomes a kind of sacred space, not just me, not just you, but something larger that emerges between us. Heidegger too spoke of being with as fundamental to human existence. Our very sense of self is bound up with others, even in their absence. Psychology echoes this in the study of nonverbal communication. Research shows that presence, eye contact, and silence can regulate emotions and even synchronize brain activity between people. Connection reshapes us, right down to the nervous system. In my own life, the deepest moments of belonging have not been when I had the right words, but when I felt aligned in silence, when someone's simple presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in carrying what felt unbearable. Insight prompts. When have you felt a connection in silence rather than words? Do you notice the energy of a room or person before anything is spoken? What relationships in your life carry that sense of more than me, more than you? Theory in action. This week, notice the space between yourself and others. Pause in conversation. Resist the urge to fill the silence too quickly. Sit with someone without distraction, allowing presence itself to do the work. See if the moment deepens not because of what you say, but because of what you allow. Time's transformations in unspoken currents. We explored how nearness and distance first reveal themselves in relationships, those fragile thresholds that tell us whether someone is safe to draw closer to, or whether distance might serve as protection. But thresholds don't stay still. With time, they shift, bend, and sometimes break. What once felt like closeness can grow suffocating, while what seemed like distance might open into trust. Time's transformations asks us to consider how relationships evolve not just through presence or absence, but through the slow shaping of time itself. The way closeness can fade into familiarity and distance can soften into longing. How seasons of life reshape who we are about others. The bittersweet truth is that not all connections are meant to remain fixed. The quiet wisdom in noticing when thresholds have naturally changed, without forcing them back to what they once were. The passage of time has a way of redrawing the maps we once thought permanent. Friendships that felt like home may drift into memory, while people who once stood at a distance can move gently closer. Relationships are living organisms. They breathe, expand, contract, and sometimes dissolve. The challenge isn't to freeze them in place, but to notice the transformations and respond with honesty rather than clinging. This part invites us to honor the fluidity of relationships, to see time not as a thief, but as a sculptor, shaping thresholds in ways that teach us about impermanence and resilience. Personal reflection. I remember one friendship that defined much of my younger years. We were inseparable, bound by shared laughter, long nights of conversation, and the comfort of always knowing the other was there. Over time, though, life carried us in different directions. Our closeness thinned, not because of betrayal or harm, but simply because the seasons of our lives no longer aligned. For a while, I tried to force the connection back to what it had been, as if the past could be preserved in amber. But eventually, I realized that what we had was real for its time, and its quiet fading didn't make it any less meaningful. That realization freed me from resentment. It allowed me to treasure what had been without needing it to remain unchanged. Time had transformed the threshold from constant presence to a fond memory, and the gift was learning to accept that shift with grace. Psychological, philosophical insight. The philosopher Heraclitus once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." This captures the essence of time's transformations. In psychology, this reality is reflected in the concept of relational developmental trajectories, which emphasizes that relationships are not static but follow paths influenced by life stages, external pressures, and inner growth. Sociologist Anthony Giddens also spoke of pure relationships, those that survive only so long as they provide emotional satisfaction to both parties. Time, then, becomes both the test and the tutor, showing us which connections deepen, which fade, and which need to be released. I've noticed that when I resist these shifts, I suffer, but when I acknowledge that thresholds move as time passes, I'm less afraid of endings and more open to new beginnings. Insight prompts. Where in your life has time quietly shifted a relationship without conflict or rupture? Do you cling to what once was or allow the threshold to transform naturally? How do you honor what has changed without resenting the passage of time? Theory in action. This week, choose one relationship in your life that feels different now compared to before. Write down how it once was, how it is now, and what time has taught you about it. Instead of mourning what's been lost, try to frame the change as a transformation. Notice whether this perspective softens your relationship to impermanence. The quiet thresholds. Some thresholds arrive loudly with conflict or confession. Others emerge quietly in the spaces between words. These subtle thresholds, pauses, silences, and hesitations often carry more weight than we first realize. They are not always about endings or beginnings, but about the delicate ways connection shifts beneath the surface. This part looks at how silence and the unspoken shape our relationships, how absence can communicate as powerfully as presence, and how intuition often senses these moments long before reason can name them. Themes and attributes, invisible shifts, the ways relationships change in silence, without words or declarations. The weight of unspoken things, how what is not said can shape us more than what is. The pause between, the role of hesitation, waiting, and subtle cues in defining connection. Intuition as signal, learning to trust the felt sense of when something has changed, even if it's unnamed. The unspoken current, not every turning point announces itself. Some arrive like whispers, hidden in the pauses of conversation, the long gaps between replies, or the laughter that no longer rings as freely as before. These are the quiet thresholds, not explosive, but erosive, the kind that shifts the ground beneath us slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day we look back and realize everything has changed. Silence is rarely neutral. Sometimes it holds a connection. Two people sharing a moment so full it needs no words. Other times, silence is a withdrawal, a retreat, a sign that something has gone unspoken for too long. To live relationally is to learn to read these currents, to discern when silence is a bridge and when it's a wall. Personal reflection. I've lived through both sides of silence. One friendship in particular still lingers in my memory. It ended not with an argument, but with silence that stretched longer and longer until it became its kind of answer. Messages that used to bring joy dwindled to single words, then to nothing at all. At first, I filled in the blanks with stories. Maybe they were busy, maybe it was just a phase. But over time, I realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was communication. That realization was more painful than anger could have been. Anger gives you something to push against. Silence leaves you with yourself, replaying every detail, wondering if you missed the signs. But silence has also been a gift in my life. I think of evenings spent in the quiet presence of someone I loved, where no words were needed, and the silence carried more intimacy than conversation ever could. Those moments taught me that silence isn't the absence of communication, but a different language, one that can be either deeply healing or deeply wounding, depending on the context. What I've come to understand is that silence reveals not just the state of the relationship, but the state of the self. When I was insecure, silence terrified me. It echoed like rejection. When I was grounded, silence felt expansive, a reminder that connection isn't proven by constant noise. Learning to read silence, not as a single thing, but as a spectrum, has been one of the hardest and most important lessons of my relationships. Psychological and philosophical insight psychology gives us a language for why silence is so powerful. Nonverbal communication research shows that upwards of 65% of meaning in human interaction is conveyed without words, tone, gesture, and yes, silence. Edward T. Hall's concept of proxemics highlights how silence and space regulate intimacy and power, shaping how safe or unsafe we feel with another person. Silence, in this sense, is both a signal and a boundary. The idea of implicit relational knowing, Daniel Stern. deepens this: the recognition that our bodies and nervous systems are constantly communicating beneath awareness. When someone pulls away in silence, our system often knows before our mind does. The body feels the absence, the cooling of connection, even if the person hasn't said a word. There's also a philosophical dimension here. In Buddhist thought, silence is revered as a teacher, a space where presence is heightened and truth can emerge without distortion. But Western traditions sometimes treat silence as absence or avoidance, a void to be filled. These cultural differences matter. The same silence can be felt as connection in one context and rejection in another. I've experienced both truths. When I lost a friendship through silence, I felt the weight of implicit withdrawal, my nervous system bracing for loss before my mind could explain it. But when I sat in silence with a partner, I felt the opposite, my nervous system relaxing into safety, a reminder that presence doesn't always need words. Silence, I've learned, is not empty. It's full of signals, meanings, and thresholds waiting to be recognized. Insight prompts: recall a silence that felt nourishing. What made it safe? Recall a silence that felt like disconnection. What signals told you so? Do you tend to interpret silence as peace or as distance? Theory in action. In your interactions this week, notice the silences. If they feel uneasy, name it gently. I sense some distance. Is something shifting? If they feel grounded, allow yourself to rest in them without rushing to fill the space. Let the silence speak for itself and see what truths it reveals. Endings as beginnings so far. We've traced thresholds of closeness, distance, and silence. Now we turn to one of the hardest thresholds of all: endings. The closing of a relationship often feels like failure, but endings can also be thresholds into transformation. They confront us with loss, but they also invite us into renewal, forcing us to shed what no longer fits and opening us to who we are becoming. This part looks at how we make sense of endings and how farewells can carry meaning beyond grief, themes and attributes the necessary ending, recognizing when something has run its course. Identity shifts, how endings strip away old roles and reveal new selves. Transformation in loss, the way grief can become fertile ground for growth. Continuity in change, how some endings are not final, but openings to a different form of connection. The door that closes, the path that opens endings are rarely tidy. They come with tangled emotions, sadness, relief, regret, and even gratitude. They can feel like betrayal or like liberation. What they always carry is a sense of crossing, leaving behind a version of life that cannot be reclaimed. Think of a door closing. On one side, the warmth of what was shared, the patterns of familiarity, the comfort of routine. On the other side, uncertainty, possibility, and the daunting task of reorienting. That moment of crossing is what gives endings their weight. We often resist them because we fear the unknown, clinging to what is familiar, even if it no longer nourishes us. Yet again and again, endings prove to be thresholds we cannot avoid, and sometimes thresholds we desperately need. Personal reflection. One of the hardest endings in my life was a friendship that had spanned more than 25 years. We had grown up together, shared milestones, and walked each other through storms. But as we grew older, our values began to diverge. Life, family, and work came into the mixture. Conversations that once flowed with ease became strained. I found myself holding back parts of who I was, editing my words to avoid conflict, until eventually I realized I wasn't showing up as myself anymore. Ending that friendship felt like tearing out a piece of my history. I resisted it for years, telling myself loyalty meant staying no matter what. But when the break finally came, I was left with both grief and relief. Grief for the person I had known since the age of 4, relief for the freedom to breathe again. Looking back now, I see that ending as a threshold into a new identity. Without that friendship, I had to rediscover who I was outside of the shared we. It was painful, yes, but it also made space for connections that aligned with the person I had become, not the person I used to be. That ending didn't erase the connection that had been real. It simply carved out a new chapter, one I could only reach by letting go. Psychological and philosophical insight psychology helps us understand why endings feel so destabilizing. Attachment disruption theory suggests that when a bond dissolves, our nervous system interprets it as danger, triggering grief responses, similar to withdrawal from an addictive substance. This explains why even unhealthy relationships can be so hard to leave. The bond is wired into us biologically. At the same time, William Bridges' transition model reframes endings as part of a three-stage process: ending, neutral zone, and new beginning. The neutral zone, that messy in between where the old has gone but the new has not yet formed, is often the most difficult. But it is also the space of deepest transformation, where identity can be rewritten. Spiritually, many traditions treat endings not as failures but as initiations. In Taoist philosophy, the principle of wu wei, yielding, releasing, reminds us that clinging resists the natural flow of life. Endings, in this sense, are not disruptions, but part of the cyclical rhythm of existence. For me, the end of that decade-long friendship confirmed these truths. It felt like withdrawal, painful, confusing, full of longing. Yet over time, the neutral zone became fertile ground. I discovered parts of myself that had been suppressed in the old dynamic. The ending had not destroyed me, it had in a way recreated me. Insight prompts: think of an ending in your life. Did you resist it, or did you sense it was necessary? What neutral zone did you go through afterwards, and what did it teach you? Can you identify something new that entered your life only because of that ending? Theory in action. This week, take one ending in your life, big or small, and reframe it as a threshold. Ask yourself, what identity did it strip away? What possibility did it open? Write it down, not as a story of failure, but as a chapter of transformation. Let yourself see the path that opened when the door closed. The return threshold. If endings strip us down and force us across thresholds of loss, there is another crossing that is just as profound: the return. Not all departures are permanent. Some people, some relationships, circle back into our lives. Sometimes we return to each other changed. Sometimes we attempt to step back into old roles that no longer fit. The return threshold tests not just the bond, but the ways we've grown, asking whether connection can be rekindled, and at what cost. Themes and attributes: cyclical connections, relationships that fade and resurface over time. The test of growth: when we reunite, do we meet each other as who we were or who we are? Forgiveness and reconciliation, the delicate work of repairing broken trust. The illusion of same as before, recognizing that no return is truly a reset. The past always leaves its mark. Circles and spirals. There's a myth we often tell ourselves that if someone comes back, things can return to how they were. But life isn't linear. When a relationship circles back, it's never to the same place. More often, it's to a spiral further along the path. Both people have changed, circumstances have shifted, and the past has etched itself into the present. The return threshold can feel like hope, a second chance to reclaim something once lost. But it can also feel like danger if old wounds are reopened or patterns resurface. Whether the return heals or harms depends not on nostalgia, but on whether both people can honor the growth that's happened in between. Personal reflection. I once reconnected with someone I had cut ties with years before. At the time of our ending, the relationship had been destructive, full of unspoken resentment and mismatched expectations. When they reached out again, I hesitated. Part of me longed for the ease of our early connection, but another part braced for the old hurts to repeat. When we met again, I realized we had both changed. They had softened in ways I didn't expect, and I had grown firmer in my boundaries. At first, the conversations felt healing, like two people returning not to the past, but to a new possibility. Yet over time, I noticed familiar dynamics creeping back in, subtle patterns that hadn't disappeared but had only gone dormant. That return taught me something vital. Reconciliation is not the same as regression. You cannot step into the same river twice. The question is not, can this be what it was? But can this be something new? Sometimes the answer is yes. Other times the most loving choice is to let the return be brief, a moment of acknowledgement, not a lifelong reunion. Psychological and philosophical insight Carl Jung described the return as a symbolic part of individuation, the journey of leaving behind old forms, encountering transformation, and then circling back to integrate what was lost. In myths, the return often appears as the hero coming home with wisdom, changed by the trials endured. Relationships mirror this pattern. A return can only be successful if the wisdom of growth is carried into it. Social psychology adds another layer. Relational dialectics theory suggests that relationships are never stable, but are always negotiating opposing forces: autonomy versus connection, openness versus closeness. When people return to one another, those tensions don't vanish, they re-emerge, sometimes stronger. In my case, returning to that old connection revealed both growth and shadow. I could appreciate the tenderness that had once existed, while also refusing to collapse back into old patterns. The insight wasn't that reconciliation failed, but that it had to evolve. The return was not a doorway back, but a threshold forward. Insight prompts: have you ever had someone return to your life after an ending? How did it feel different? What changed in you, and what stayed the same? Did the return deepen growth, or tempt you back into old patterns? Theory in action. If a relationship from your past re-emerges, pause before stepping in fully. Ask yourself, am I meeting this person as who I am now, or as who I once was? Notice whether the dynamic honors your growth. Practice naming what's different, out loud if you can. That honesty may be what transforms the return from a cycle into a spiral. The threshold of transformation. Having explored endings and returns, we now arrive at the deeper threshold that underlies them all: transformation. Relationships don't just give us companionship, they change us. Every bond reshapes identity, rewires patterns, and alters the stories we tell about ourselves. Transformation thresholds ask us to confront who we become in the presence of another, and who we must become when they leave. Themes and attributes identity alchemy, the ways relationships reshape who we are. Trials by fire, moments when conflict or loss forces deep change. Expansion of self, how love, even in its difficulty, enlarges our sense of possibility. The shadow of change, a transformation that costs us stability, safety, or innocence. The crucible of relationship. Every transformation begins with a kind of death, the dissolving of an old identity, the collapse of a familiar role. Relationships often provide the crucible for this process. They pressure us, confront us, challenge us in ways solitary life cannot. And in that crucible, we are forced to shed skins we didn't even know we were wearing. Sometimes this transformation is joyful, a love that awakens dormant parts of ourselves, drawing out courage or creativity we didn't realize we possessed. Other times it is brutal, a betrayal, a loss, or a rupture that cracks us open and forces us to rebuild from the inside out. In either case, transformation thresholds remind us that to relate is to risk becoming someone new. Personal reflection. I can trace some of the biggest shifts in my life to the thresholds of relationships. One love early on taught me to see the world through someone else's eyes, a transformation of empathy. Another, later, shattered my illusions of permanence when it ended suddenly, teaching me resilience I didn't want to learn. But perhaps the most profound transformation came not from romance, but from friendship. A close friend once called me out on a pattern of avoidance I had never admitted to myself. Their honesty stung. At first I pulled away, defensive and ashamed. But in time, I realized they had shown me a mirror I needed. That confrontation shifted how I handled conflict from then on. It was painful, but it freed me from years of silent withdrawal. These transformations weren't comfortable, but they were necessary. They shaped not only who I was with others, but who I became in solitude. Each threshold carried both loss and gift, stripping away illusions while granting me a truer sense of self. Psychological and philosophical insight psychologists speak of post-traumatic growth, the idea that suffering can lead to profound shifts in values, priorities, and identity. While trauma scars, it can also carve out a new space for meaning. Similarly, philosophers from Nietzsche to Kierkegaard have written of transformation as a kind of necessary death, an invitation to let go of the old self, so the new self can emerge. Spiritually, many traditions frame transformation as initiation. In rites of passage, an initiate must symbolically die to one stage of life before being reborn into another. Relationships can serve as these rites. They confront us with trials that strip away pretense and demand growth. For me, those transformations often came disguised as crises. A betrayal that once broke me eventually deepened my boundaries and sharpened my intuition. A loss that left me hollow eventually opened me to grief's strange gift, a greater tenderness toward others. Transformation was never what I wanted, but always what I needed. Insight prompts. What relationship has transformed you the most? Did it come through joy or loss? What part of yourself died in that transformation, and what was born? Do you resist or embrace the crucible when it comes? Theory in action. Notice one transformation in your relational history. Write down not only what was lost, but what was gained. Frame it not as damage, but as initiation. Ask yourself, what did this crucible make possible in me that wouldn't exist otherwise? Thresholds of wholeness. Having travelled through nearness, distance, silence, endings, returns, and transformation, we arrive at the final threshold, wholeness. Relationships will always shape and shift us, but the ultimate task is learning to integrate those changes into a grounded self, one that honors connection without losing identity, one that can love without dissolving into the other. Themes and attributes integration, weaving together the fragments shaped by relationships. Balance, holding closeness and autonomy without collapse. Spacious presence, allowing relationships to expand us without erasing us. Self in relation, recognizing that wholeness is not solitude, but groundedness within connection. The circle that holds wholeness is not perfection. It is not about having unbreakable boundaries or flawless connections. Wholeness is the circle that can hold all of it, the joys and ruptures, the closeness and distance, the beginnings and endings. It is the recognition that we are not defined by any single threshold, but by the way we weave them into a coherent self. When we integrate, we stop chasing the illusion that another person can complete us. Instead, we meet them as whole beings, ready to expand but not erase. The threshold of wholeness is not the absence of need, but the presence of balance. It is knowing that we can belong without vanishing and love without losing. Personal reflection. For much of my life, I thought wholeness meant independence, not needing anyone, never being vulnerable. But that wholeness was armor. Over time, I learned that true wholeness is not self-sufficiency, but self-groundedness. I remember one relationship where I finally felt this shift. I could say no without fear, ask for closeness without shame, and allow space without panic. For the first time, I felt both tethered and free, like the relationship added to me, but didn't define me. That balance didn't come overnight. It was born of the many thresholds before, the endings, the returns, the silences. Each had shaped me, tested me, and eventually taught me how to stand in my center. Wholeness is not static. I still wobble. I still feel the pull of old patterns. But I return again and again to that center, not perfect, but whole enough to love without losing myself. Psychological and philosophical insight Gestalt psychology offers a helpful lens. Wholeness is about integration. We are not meant to cut off parts of ourselves, but to bring them into awareness, even the painful ones. In relationships, this means recognizing how each bond has left its imprint and choosing to weave those imprints into a cohesive identity. Philosopher Martin Buber spoke of the I-thou relationship, an encounter where we meet the other not as object or role, but as a whole being. Wholeness in this sense is not self-enclosure but self-presence, a groundedness that makes true meeting possible. For me, wholeness has meant recognizing that every threshold, nearness, distance, ending, transformation, has left me both scarred and strengthened. The task is not to erase those marks, but to weave them into a self that can love without fear, connect without collapse, and stand whole even in the flux of relationship. Insight prompts. What does wholeness mean to you? Independence, integration, balance. Can you trace how past relationships have contributed to your sense of self? Where do you still feel fragmented, and what would integration look like there? Theory in action. This week, take time to map your relational thresholds, closeness, silence, endings, and transformations. Ask yourself, what did each add? What did each take away? Then imagine weaving them into one whole self. Not perfect, not finished, but whole enough to hold it all. Thresholds, as transformations, exits, and entrances, shape the rhythm of our lives. They remind us that connection is not static. It expands, contracts, breaks, and sometimes returns in unexpected ways. To stay is not always a strength. To leave is not always failure. Each threshold asks us to listen carefully, to ourselves, to the other, and to the moment we are in. When we begin to trust that endings can transform us, and that departures can carry their kind of love, we stop seeing thresholds as loss and start seeing them as places of becoming. You've been listening to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, every threshold you cross is also a beginning. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse. A journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episode 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.